Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Jer. It's good to be with you. It's been really fun to listen in on this conversation as it's been unfolding throughout the day. I'm the other co-founding director of Global Immersion, and I'm an everyday peacemaker who lives in Bend, Oregon, which is a non-border and predominantly white social location. I want to give you a little bit of context for my city because I think it's going to frame up the work that we're going to do together here in this particular workshop. In my city, migrants hide in fear in overcrowded apartments and in secluded trailer parks. And the reason for their fear is because in Central Oregon, there's a history of ICE raids that have been abduction style. So ICE comes into our city and then operates almost in a kidnapping format that has been taking our migrant neighbors away from us, that we oftentimes don't find out about it until the next morning. Bend is a historically conservative location. That's one of the fastest growing cities in the country right now. There's two primary migrations that are informing this growth. First is the white wealth, and these people are coming from cosmopolitan centers. These are people with privilege, and they want to leave the big city, and they long to consume a lot of the high alpine opportunities that Bend has to offer. The second group are migrant families who are following the agriculture and construction booms that are happening throughout Central Oregon. Right now, we have a population of about 13,000 migrants, and the estimate is about half of them are undocumented. There's also an estimate that we have nearly 6,000 DACA recipients here throughout the region. The economic crisis triggered by COVID has made our migrant and immigrant families, many of which have US citizen dependents, especially vulnerable. And for me, contending as an everyday peacemaker within my context has taken on multiple forms. It's looked like following the ant trails in my community to the spaces where my Latinx neighbors are creating and commenting on culture, and then building flourishing relationships with them. It looks like organizing, educating, and mobilizing local faith communities. It's looked like aligning with a larger statewide network to stand against ICE and getting them out of our prisons, to fight against dehumanizing policies, and to fight for the legal mobility of our migrants in the form of driver's license. It's looked like working with city leaders to contend for and attain a welcoming status for the city of Bend. It's looked like writing op-eds to educate the larger community about immigration. It's looked like accompanying migrant families all the way through the criminal justice system. It's looked like sending a delegation of dreamers from Central Oregon all the way to Washington, D.C. so that they can advocate for just policy with regard to DACA recipients. It's looked like hosting listening sessions for statewide politicians so that they can learn of the disproportionate physical, economic, and educational impact that COVID is having upon our migrant families. Most recently, everyday peacemaking has taken the shape of civil disobedience as we blocked ICE prison buses containing two of our abducted neighbors. It's involved working with local law enforcement such that they exercise more discretion in traffic stops with Latin neighbors. It's included shaping a public PSA featuring conservative, liberal, and BIPOC leaders that denounces white supremacy and commits to understanding how white supremacy has shaped our community and impacts our marginalized neighbors. It's looked like linking the local justice ecosystem in order to create a network of support and safety for our BIPOC neighbors in anticipation of what was a chaotic election. Now, each of these illustrations of contending within a non-border city is the result of years worth of seeing and immersing. And I want to argue this afternoon that the physical border erected between our two countries is not the only borderland here in the United States. It's not the only borderland that we as people of faith have to navigate. All of us are embedded within spaces that are inundated with visible and invisible walls that divide us. The question is, how do we as everyday peacemakers navigate life's borderlands as makers of peace? In this workshop, we're going to move beyond a direct conversation about immigration and expand our understanding of borderlands. In the next hour, we're going to explore peacemaking lessons learned from within a national borderland in an effort to grow our capacity to navigate life's borderlands as everyday peacemakers. And to get us going, I want to offer a framing illustration and then move us quickly into breakouts for a brief working session. Here's the illustration. At the very edge of our southwest border, the wall cuts Friendship Circle between Borderlands State Park and Playas right in half. In our immersion trips, where we're training everyday peacemakers, we typically have a conversation about organized crime and the effectiveness or not of the wall to stop the trafficking of drugs. With a nod to the commitment and creativity of the cartels, Border Patrol frequently offers this statement: show me a 20-foot wall, and I'll show you a 21-foot ladder. Now, the point is that the cartels will not allow a wall, barrier, or border to impede their work. That should raise three questions for us as everyday peacemakers. Number one, are we aware of the visible and invisible walls, barriers, and borders that exist in our neighborhoods? Number two, do we share the cartel's commitment and creativity to transcending those borders within our communities? Number three, what are the 21-foot ladders necessary to get us over those walls and into relationship with those on the other side? Friends, if we want to dismantle the walls that divide us in our cities, we must learn to see the borders within our own communities, get creative and collaborative in the ways that we transcend them, and then cultivate uncommon friendships with those on the other side. For it's in the context of these uncommon friendships that the plans for dismantling the walls that divide us start to take shape. So I want to move us into our first breakout session right now around these two questions. Number one, what is one wall, barrier, or border in your neighborhood? Question two, what communities are separated from one another because that wall exists? I'm going to give you 10 minutes into breakouts, and then we'll come right back in to continue this conversation. So go ahead right now, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Hey, welcome back, everyone. I changed backgrounds because I got some feedback that it looked like my face was just kind of floating like a wizard. And so I think I'm going to try to shift my background every session. Watch this. You never know where I'm going to show up. Okay, good. Let's move into this next segment. In this next segment, I want to explore Jesus, who created a community that was inundated with borders. And I'm going to make the argument that Jesus did it on purpose. Out of a quick show of hands, how many of y'all have been to the fishing village of Capernaum in the Middle East? Just put your hand up if you've actually been to Capernaum. Okay, there's some of you. Some of you have been to Capernaum. Okay, great. Capernaum was and is, but you can see it in the ruins, but was a tiny yet prospering fishing village on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. And it existed right on the Imperial Highway. It was composed primarily of farmers and fishermen who would provide services for highway travelers. The village was home to Jews, Gentiles, and Romans. And what we learn in the Gospels is that after a near lethal experience in Nazareth, Jesus relocated 43 miles from Nazareth to Capernaum, which then became his base camp, his headquarters for his mission. One of the first actions that Jesus engaged in was to build a community that was centered on restorative mission that would oscillate between peacemaking practice and reflection. In the naming of the disciples in Matthew 10, Mark 3, and Luke 6, the authors don't merely provide an idea of diversity, but of a community composed of enemies. Let me explain. I want to center Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon, a zealot, as the example here. So Matthew was a tax collector who worked for Rome. Now, taxes were a Roman strategy utilized to exert power and control and to reinforce the idea of the inferiority of the Hebrew people. Tax collectors weren't Romans, they were Hebrews who were recruited and then who had to make a sacrifice to a pagan god named Caesar in order to assume the office. The role of the tax collector was to extract the tax for the Romans from the Hebrew people. They accomplished this by sending Roman troops to invade Hebrew homes, especially the homes of withholders. With the backing of Roman law enforcement, they often overtaxed their own bloodline for personal profit. Tax collectors were used by Rome. They were hated with a vile vengeance by their own people, which meant that they didn't belong to anyone. Simon was a zealot who worked against Rome. The zealot philosophy was simple. There's one God. Israel is to serve him. The Torah is the guide for righteous living, and serving the empire in any way, including the paying of taxes, was apostasy against God. They based their behaviors on Phinehas. In Numbers 25, we learn that Phinehas was one of Aaron's sons, and he was praised for his zeal for God because they believed that it imitated the zeal of God. That Phinehas carried a spear gave credence to zealots' commitment to violence if necessary. They believed that the violent protection of God and violent resistance to unfaithfulness was considered their God-ordained responsibility. They were committed to the idea of a coming Messiah who would be a military leader and who would prevail over the Romans and Herodians. They experienced Roman occupation as an affront to God, as Yahweh was the owner of the land and the people. Rome would frequently call for censuses, and that was their approach to get a better head count so they could understand how to tax the people more lucratively. Every time there was a census, it would fan the flames of hatred within the zealots. They belonged to God and no one else. And so in protest, they refused to pay taxes to Rome and therefore hated the tax collectors who abused them and their families. Zealots were notorious for plotting the demise of tax collectors. So when Jesus invited 12 to follow him, he counted Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot as two of them. Now, again, the reason I asked how many of you have been to Capernaum, and the reason I lifted up how small this particular village is because if I stood on one side of Capernaum and yelled loud enough, you could hear me on the other side. Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot were from Capernaum. It was a tiny village. These two men probably grew up next to one another. They probably observed each other's upbringing and shifts into one working for Rome and one working against Rome. Matthew represented the group that ultimately conspired to kill Jesus. Simon represented the palm branch people who misunderstood Jesus as a militaristic revolutionary. These were two men, neighbors, probably school playmates, who were divided by difference, and they likely understood one another as enemies. So, why did Jesus create a community of enemies on purpose? Why did Jesus raise up a community that was inundated with borders and boundaries and invisible walls? Let me offer two ideas. One, Jesus' vision was beloved community, where unity was not uniformity, but was composed of diversity in every possible way. Two, uncommon friendships are incubators for our transformation. It's very easy, if not convenient, to be with people who are just like me theologically, politically, socioeconomically, educationally, and ethnically. It's very hard work to transcend the borders of difference in order to discover our shared belovedness, find common ground, and grow restorative alliances. And so I'm going to move us into another breakout, and this is just a rapid breakout. For those of you who weren't able to get to a breakout in the last segment, we're just going to create this space right here. There might be 10 or so of you. The prompts for this breakout will be conducive for a breakout that size. So feel free to stay here and use this space to have this conversation. 3 quick prompts. Number 1, what just stood out to you from this last segment? Number 2, what has been one practice that has been helpful for you in transcending the borders of difference in your space? Question 3, why is building uncommon friendships so hard? I'll move you into breakouts, and then we'll come back to talk about these things in 10 minutes. See you in 10.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh,
Hi, you're driving.
yes, I am driving.
Where are
Seems
you?
I am in Kansas, Episcopal Diocese of Western Kansas.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I was just working with Hispanic ministries in Dodge City. So
Nice.
now I'm driving back home.
Nice. I guess what stood out to me was I never, I guess I've always thought of the apostles as being a cohesive group rather than people who may have been at odds. So that was interesting to me. I mean, even though I know the stories, it just became more palpable as he explained it.
Yeah, I know, and nobody showed it but my last breakout, but one of the things that he was talking about too in regards to what kind of borders or what have you are there within your own backyard, so to speak. And I know one of the things that I face in my particular diocese, especially in Southwest Kansas, I'm the only Hispanic minister for my diocese. And one of the big things is this was at our convention this year, it was the first time we've ever included Spanish in liturgy.
Wow.
We have had a very uphill road just trying to get people to recognize that there's other people besides white people out here. And so I work in an area that is 50 to 60% Hispanic. But the congregations are white. They fear Hispanics, and they fear being taken over by Hispanics and losing their whiteness. And so it's a very difficult fence to straddle.
Sure.
Hi, this is Cheryl Janis. There are very distinct divisions, both where I live and very, very distinct divisions in my parish, which is Christ Church, Coronado. And it's interesting, you go 1/2 mile either way from my house and you see the ethnic neighborhoods. Nothing in quote, my neighborhood. You see people white people voicing that they will not go to a certain Walmart because it is in the middle of an ethnic, predominantly Hispanic and African American neighborhood. And through the years, I have seen those walls, those barriers get taller and taller and taller. Thank you.
Wow. I'm up here in the greater Seattle area. And yes, certainly we have incidences, especially around police actions, and we've had some protests around that. But also, not far from me is the most diverse zip code in the United States.
Oh, wow.
And you really can't go anywhere, you know, at least I can't in my experience, where there's not diversity on the streets. Now, in terms of social groups, I have to say that I've been working primarily with undocumented immigrants for 35 years. And that has become my community. And so what's odd to me is when I go someplace, it's all white.
Mhm.
Maybe I need a reality check.
I
Is there any-
have the experience of I was an exchange student for a year in Mexico, and so it became very real for me what it feels like to be not in a predominantly white place, and the prejudices that came at me for, you know, being a woman, coming from this country, just the things they assumed about me. And it really, it will stay with me always, because I will know exactly how it feels, or somewhat how it feels, to be,
Mm.
you know, a quote unquote stranger in a different country. So I'm grateful for that experience.
Mm. This has been many years ago, but I did a summer program at the Anglican Seminary in Mexico City. And we had our little times of going out and doing touristy kind of things. And I took my purse out to get my wallet out to pay for something. And very quickly, there was this crowd of men pressing in on me. And the person that rescued me from that was one of the seminarians who was paying close attention. But that was a very unique early experience for me. I've had to really, in my growth, understand that as a white person, that doesn't mean I am the great fixer. And that's been the biggest thing I've learned, I think. Are we all still here?
I'm here.
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here. I'm
Uh,
I'm
here.
here. I'm here.
all right.
I am here.
And add to the.
Can't hear you. Unmute. Cheryl, unmute.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, unmuting helps. Is that the news that went nationwide, that the activist wanted no police at all, defund the police, get rid of the police. As a matter of fact, part of that came out of Portland. And it was through my own research this weekend that is not the mindset of our citizens of color, not at all. Another thing that I would like to see disseminated as truth, and I just don't know why the news media cannot educate. Maybe there's not enough viewership to warrant it. Thank you.
Jer, excuse me, Jer, you have 30 seconds.
Excellent, thank you.
I've had to plug in.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I want to, in this segment, I want to use that last question as a bit of a launch pad. The question is, why is building uncommon friendships so hard? I want to take us through a bit of a progression that's based on my experience of accompanying thousands of relationships through hard things, navigating difference, dismantling the walls of division between two folk. But it's also it's a practice, or it's a habit that I find kind of comes up in my own life as well, that makes building uncommon friendships so challenging. I want to start by offering this idea. We've been groomed to believe that the person on the other side of that issue is an enemy to avoid rather than a friend to have. Let me say that again. We've been groomed to believe that the person on the other side is an enemy to avoid rather than a friend to have. This is often how this happens. We hear something about them, whatever them is for you. Maybe it's Antifa, maybe it's anti-maskers, maybe it's blacks, maybe it's immigrants, maybe it's gays, maybe it's conservatives, maybe it's liberals, whatever it is. We hear something about them. In short order, the fable fabrication begins. That is, we begin to write stories, usually inside of our heads. We draft stories about that group, and those stories emerge not out of reality, but based on my creative and often critical imagination. Then I rehearse these stories, and over time I congratulate myself on my own ingenuity. And then I begin to build alliances with others who have written similar stories about them. Then I codify my book of fables, which unfairly and inaccurately dehumanizes them. And then I use my book of stories, my made-up truths, to justify my terrible behavior toward them. Eventually, I commit more energy to believing and defending my fabricated stories than drawing near to them to learn about them from them. In this progression, potential friends and neighbors become others and even enemies. Now, I want to offer a word on enemies, and I don't know if I were to ask you or this group of people to define what you understand to be enemy. I wonder what you would say. And I've done this in rooms all across the country, and if there's 100 people, I'll get 100 different answers. What I've found is that an enemy is rarely someone who plots or enacts violence against you. Rather, according to our friend Oshita Moore, who's an author and a pastor in Minneapolis, an enemy is anyone who exists just beyond the reach of our empathy. Or as Dr. John A. Smith at Cal Berkeley would say, it's anybody who exists outside the circle of our human concern. So again, an enemy is rarely someone who plots and enacts violence against you. Rather, according to Oshita Moore, your enemy is anyone who exists just beyond the reach of your empathy. It's that person who exists just outside the circle of your human concern, according to John A. Smith. Let me illustrate this. In one of our immersion trips where we train everyday peacemakers, we actually immerse into the Middle East, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Often our itinerary carries an experience with someone that I would call a radical Israeli settler. He would understand himself as a faithful Jew. And we spent time with him, often studying the Torah. And in one recent encounter pre-pandemic, we were studying the Torah, and he was commenting on his mandate to love his neighbor. Now, this particular settler lives in a settlement, a very small settlement, within one of the largest Palestinian cities in the Palestinian territories. And so when he's talking about loving his neighbor, he gave multiple qualifications for how neighbor just simply meant his fellow Israelis who live in that settlement. And so I raised my hand and I said, yes, but what about your physical neighbors that are Palestinians? Because literally they live just a stone's throw from you. And he said, those aren't my neighbors, those are my enemies. And I said, oh, but what about loving your enemies? And he said, let me stop you right there. That's not my teaching. That's your teaching. And it was in that moment that the revolutionary nature of Jesus struck me again. That Jesus is the only one who moved us to love beyond one another, to neighbor, and beyond neighbor to enemy. Now, later that afternoon, the delegation of peacemakers that we were working with went from this Israeli settlement to Bethlehem, where we had an encounter with a Christian Palestinian named Sami Awad. And Sami was talking to us about this revolutionary teaching of Jesus to love your enemy. And he said this, in order to love my enemy, I must first understand my enemy. In order to understand my enemy, I must first meet my enemy. That too is a revolutionary teaching. As I interrogate my enemies, often I recognize that they have never done something to me directly that would cause me to distinguish them as an enemy. Instead, if I interrogate my understanding of enemy, I have to admit that I have been the one that have designated them an enemy. Not based on personal experience, but on the creativity and the critical nature of my imagination. I have fabricated my own enemies. Now, let me offer just some very honest disclosure here. For me in this moment, if I'm going to use Oshita Moore's definition of enemy as anyone who lives just outside the reach of my empathy, I'm going to say that a radicalized conservative evangelical is my enemy. That person exists outside the reach of my empathy at the moment. And when I acknowledge that, it's amazing how God now begins to move me into circles that are being navigated by radicalized conservative evangelicals. It's like with the process of interrogating enemy and understanding what that means for me, I think God with a mischievous grin starts to bop those people into contact with me. I have to do something about it. So let me tell you a story. Just shortly after the pandemic began, we were about a month and a half in, and my family decided that we needed a little change of scenery, a little change of pace. I have 3 little kiddos, and we needed a breath. So we decided to pack up our gear and head to the wilderness in Central Oregon, up in the mountains to camp. We figured we'd be physically distanced from everyone, we'd have a little bit of adventure, and it would be a good time. An hour after setting up our camp, I heard the sound of a diesel truck. And wouldn't you know it, that the diesel truck was making its way on a logging road directly to where we were. And within 15 minutes, another family had arrived and set up a camp not 50 yards away from my family's camp. So much for solitude and some physical distancing in the wilderness, especially when kids are involved. Now, my 12-year-old is a natural born leader, and she loves being creative and organizing little kids. And so she jumped right into action with her little brothers and these two little kids that came with this other family. They began to play and have a blast, and they were in the water, and Ava was overseeing it. And so this other couple were so impressed with Ava that they wanted to understand the parents of this kid. So they came over and introduced themselves. When they showed up, both the male and the female were chewing tobacco. They both had not one, but two sidearms on their hips. And immediately the stereotypes and the prejudices began to churn inside of me. This is what my enemy looks like. And they introduced themselves, and I didn't want to be interrupted. I wanted a wilderness adventure with my family. But in this moment, I had to recognize either I'm going to be interruptible or this is going to be a miserable weekend. And so we began to cultivate a relationship. My wife and I are voracious friend makers. And we began to get to know this couple. And with as much physical distance as we could offer, we stood around fires with one another, and we began to hear stories about one another. Now, this gentleman and I both share a love for the wilderness. And I began to recognize that he has some practices out in the wilderness that I really appreciate, and I actually wanted to learn from. And so we exchanged information, and I said, hey, at some point, I'd like to travel out into the wilderness with you and learn from you how you do what you do. So about a month later, I sent him a text message and I said, hey, I've got an open weekend. Can we explore the wilderness together? And he said yes. And so it was just he and I. We made a base camp in the mountains, and we spent 3 days hiking the mountains together. After the first day, we were sitting around the fire, cooking up some food. And he asks this question. He says, so I need you to tell me something. He says, I've been researching you online. And I see that you navigate conflict zones and issues of injustice. And I think I had just recently been in Portland and had actually been shot twice with non-lethal rounds, thankfully. And I think I had commented on my experience of a nonviolent presence and protest in Portland. And he says to me, so help me understand, what are you? Are you like CIA? Are you FBI? Like, help me understand what you are. And so I described my work to him, and I talked to him about my life's practice of peacemaking and what that looks like as I work with leaders all around the country to raise their capacity to leverage their leadership restoratively. He was fascinated by it, but then he says this, you have to understand that I'm an avowed 3%er. Now, a 3%er is someone who borrows that term from the Revolutionary War and the belief that it was only 3% of colonists that took up arms to fight for our revolution. And so a 3%er today is someone who carries guns, not to protect themselves from ferocious animals, but they carry guns to protect their rights. He identified himself as an ultra-conservative, white nationalist, avowed 3%er, and he also had an evangelical faith. The very embodiment of the person who lives outside the reach of my empathy. And so he says, do you think that's going to be a problem in our relationship? Now he's wearing the gun, so I'm going to say, no problem at all, pal. But I said, look, in the state of Oregon, you being who you are and carrying the values that you carry, and me being who I am, carrying the values that I carry, the fact that we're in relationship with one another probably makes us one of the most uncommon friendships in the state of Oregon. I go, let's keep pressing in. The next day, as we were hiking, he began to open up the story of his life to me. And he began to share with me some of the pain and the struggle of growing up an impoverished white kid in the state of Oregon. He talked to me about what it was like to accompany his wife through a bout of severe alcoholism. It was just amazing how in short time, the walls began to crumble between us, and we found ourselves building a flourishing relationship. Obviously, in the wake of the election, he and I have had much to talk about. And his perspective has been enlightening for me, and my perspective has been enlightening for him. Who knows if one day he and I might develop a creative, restorative collaboration to actually fix some broken things in our state together. So this is hard work. Our enemies aren't necessarily people who conspire violence. They're people who exist just outside the reach of our empathy. Now, borrowing from that earlier illustration of the 21-foot ladder, I put up a 21-foot ladder against the walls that would separate this friend of mine. And I climbed up that ladder, and he and I met either in the middle or maybe even on his side. I don't even know. Let me offer a couple of the rungs of my 21-foot ladder in a way to grow your capacity to either develop yours or identify the rungs of your 21-foot ladder. Let me offer just a couple. Number one, being interruptible. If we're going to cultivate uncommon friendships that transcend the borders and the boundaries and the walls in our neighborhoods, we have to become interruptible. Interruptible by another person, interrupted by their concerns, interrupted by their values, interrupted by their priorities. Are we interruptible enough to stop and then wonder with them? Second rung, curiosity. Are we people who can demonstrate unusual interest in another? That's one of my primary rungs of my 21-foot ladder. In order to be curious, I have to release the need to be right or to convert them. I need to learn how to ask questions that unlock the person's story. Here are a couple of the prompts that I use. Tell me more. I wonder what you mean by, and when did that become a value for you? Prompts like those unlock the content of a person's life. They begin to share stories. I always demonstrate gratitude for the ways in which their perspective, insight, and questions have expanded my own understanding. So I'm listening deep enough in the conversation to say, oh, that's helpful. I mirror it back to them and I say, thank you. When we engage, when we release our need to be right or convert, when we ask questions that unlock a person's story, when we practice gratitude, that's where we begin to find some common ground and some shared interests. Third rung, resilience. Come to the table and stay at the table. We have got to learn how to build some capacity to metabolize discomfort. Fourth, dare to make an ask or to receive an invitation. I dared to exchange information with this guy. I dared to make an ask and say, hey, do you want to spend some time together? Since then, he's invited me on a couple of other outings, and I've done my best where possible to accept those invitations. And with every encounter, the relationship deepens, and I'm beginning to see the pores of both of our souls open up a little bit to new possibilities. Fifth, I seek their perspective. See, I make up the stories that create the enemies that I have. Especially in the wake of the election, I sought his perspective. I wanted to understand how a radicalized conservative evangelical was processing the outcome of the election. His perspective helped me and it grew my empathy. So those are 5 rungs to my 21-foot ladder. I want to dismiss us into one final breakout, and then we'll come back together for just some closing remarks. And Gwen, if we can maybe do this in a 7-minute breakout, that would be ideal. Question 1, how did this segment impact your understanding of enemy? Second question, what is one practice of transcending borders of difference from my story that is most applicable to yours? So how did this segment impact your understanding of enemy? And what's one practice of transcending difference? What's one rung from my 21-foot ladder that's most applicable to yours? We'll move into breakouts for 7 minutes and then we'll come back for some closing remarks. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Good to be together. before I make just a couple of final remarks, a couple things in the chat thread. Yes, Oshida Moore, thanks, Dan, for referencing people to her. She's also writing a book right now called Dear White Peacemakers that that we endorse wholeheartedly. It's going to be out early 2021 and will be worth your time. So Oshida Moore, look her up, get Shalom Sisters as well. It's an incredible book. Resilience, yes, super important. I actually have a segment here on a little brief resilience training that that I cut because I tend to be a fast talker. My personality looks like my hair, and the pace of my talking is very, very fast. And so I've been trying to slow some stuff down. So there's some stuff about resilience that I think is essential for us in terms of getting equipped to grow our resilience to stay around the table. And so there's more that we can talk about as maybe we're in touch after the summit afterward. So, and then with regard to my notes, yeah, we'll make sure that y'all have access to these. Let me offer just some closing remarks and then move us into a 5-minute break. In the workshop, we've expanded beyond immigration to explore the reality that we all inhabit borderlands. Borderlands are spaces that are inundated with visible and invisible walls. And that everyday peacemakers are not just people who think about topics. We're not just immigration people. Rather, everyday peacemakers are women and men who learn to see the borders within our own communities. We get creative and collaborative in the way that we transcend them. And then we cultivate uncommon friendships with those on the other side. Yet, we're not just satisfied with a lifetime of building and scaling 21-foot ladders. The Jesus that we claim to follow and the gospel that he embodies is about dismantling the walls that divide us. And so, friends, may we continue to be transformed into everyday peacemakers who first scale and then figure out how to join God and others in dismantling the walls and eliminating the expanses.